as the saying goes, the apple never really falls far from the tree, or so they say. Kids always have some pretty remarkable resemblances to their parents. After all, their genes came from them. Offspring are created when the male sex cell of one parent fuses with the female sex cell from the other parent. That starts a zygote. The zygote can grow and develop and eventually turn into an embryo. So exactly half of your DNA comes from mom and exactly half comes from dad. So when you hear somebody say, oh, you look so much like your mom, or you look so much like your dad, well, that's because the blueprints to create you came from the same blueprints that were used to make them. Shocker. There are some interesting trends that exist with inheritance, though. Sometimes you'll get features from one parent and not the other. Sometimes you'll get features that seem to be part of both parents. Like, for example, take somebody's nose. Clearly, the instructions to create the nose that you have came from the instructions, a mixture at least, of instructions from mom and from dad. So, you are most likely to receive the same kind of appearance of your nose as one of your parents. At the very least, you're going to get a mixture of the two of them. Same thing with like hair color. Like if you look at somebody's hair, mom might have black hair, dad might have blonde hair, and somehow you come out with red hair. Those types of weird inheritance anomalies show up, and all of those can be explained through genetics. And we're going to start exploring some of those inheritance patterns. So to explore this, let's have a look at my son. He's a strapping young lad, wouldn't you say? Hit the genetic jackpot. He's half of me, after all. But let's be real, the real beauty comes from my wife. Let's look more closely at his features. His most obvious feature that most people tend to point out is skin. Since I have lighter skin and my wife has darker skin, our son ended up as an intermediate. He's darker than me, yet lighter than my wife. It's funny, when he's around my family, he seems so dark, and when he's around my wife's family, he seems so light. He doesn't seem to ever fit in. Forever alone. But back to inheritance. Many of his features are either from me or from my wife. So let's first look at my wife and I. I did a little bit of photoshopping, and I put my wife's face next to mine here, so we can kind of compare our features. Notice that the shape of the nose is very different. The shape of the face is also quite different. Her face is rounder and mine is longer. Even the chin, her chin is smoother, mine seems to jut out a little bit more. Our foreheads are roughly the same size. Even the way that our eyes are. My eyes are a little bit more sunk in than hers. Cheekbones, like there's a lot of differences between the two of us. But now let's look at a picture side by side of my son and I. Again, our son, Mika, came from a combination of my wife's genetics and my genetics. So his features are going to, at least in some part, be like mine. Let's look at this. Look at the nose. The nose has some continuity between my nose and his. You can see some of my wife's features in there as well, though. Look at his eyes. His eyes seem a little bit more sunk in, like mine. His cheeks and facial structure seem to fit mine. His chin, man, that's bang on. Like the way his chin comes in, a lot like mine. The lips, even. He shares a lot of the similar features. Now let's jump over to a picture of him and my wife. Again, notice the continuity between them. The nose is almost identical. The face shape seems to match again. Remember, it kind of matched my face as well. So where my wife and I, we have very different features from each other. When we look at a mashup of the genetic offspring of us, that little baby seems to match me, but he also seems to match her. What a cool demonstration. To help us understand how inheritance works, let's use a useful little analogy. I keep using the term blueprint as DNA, so let's actually imagine a blueprint for like a house. The blueprint, your DNA, is like the basic instructions. Here's what you do to build the house. That doesn't actually tell you every single thing about the house, though. There's other things that are involved with it. There's the fact that you can alter some of the things inside of the house. You can, once the building is constructed, certain things can change. You could even take down a wall. You can really change the structure of the house, but you still need to keep at least the basic framework, or else it doesn't really work anymore. We can extend that analogy to DNA and talk about humans. Like, sometimes things happen to humans. I could have my arm chopped off. Hopefully not. But if that were to happen, my DNA still says that part of my structure, there should be an arm. But my environment changed my very structure. That can happen. And that happens a lot. So it comes down to like who you are, who your body eventually, how your body eventually comes to be, the physical appearance of your body. It's a combination of things. It's not just your genetics, but there's also one other really important aspect. It's your environment. Another example of how the environment can really mess up your DNA is, like, for example, somebody's height. Your DNA instructs your body to grow to a maximum height. Well, what happens if you don't have the building blocks to do that? What if somebody's starving on a regular basis? This happens to children in poverty all the time, where they don't have enough food to actually reach their potential height, because during their periods of growth, their body doesn't have the resources available to actually contribute to growth. The resources need to all be spent in keeping that kid alive. So unfortunately, the environment can have a really negative impact on your genes. And eventually, if obviously the environment is a little bit too harsh and your genes can't adapt in any sort of way to keep the person alive, unfortunately sometimes the environment can have lethal consequences as well. For example, cancer. Cancer as well is one of those things that for the most part comes from a combination of your genetics and from your environment. You can receive some of your DNA that might be a little bit off. I'm not going to fully explain where cancer comes from here, but cancer is a genetic mutation. If part of your genes that you get from mom and dad have part of the genetic information to develop cancer, that puts you at a disadvantage. But your environment as well can impact your genes, can actually cause mutations. For example, like smoking. The reason why smoking is so cancerous, leads to so many cases of cancer, is it's so harsh on the throat and the lungs. The chemicals that are introduced there are really damaging to those cells. So when they try and divide, when they try and duplicate themselves, they're not in a healthy state. So when they try and duplicate the DNA inside of the cell to make a new cell inside the throat or a new cell inside your lung, if they're damaged, they might screw up when they're developing that DNA, when they're duplicating that DNA. That's what mutations are. That's what can lead to cancer. So that's not the human's genetics that are causing that. That's the environment directly affecting somebody's DNA. And really, again, cancer is just an environment, well, not entirely, but for the most part, it's an environmentally influenced change in your genetics. One of the earliest theories of inheritance came from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a a scientist who is trying to come up with an explanation as to how did a baby get to be like their parent. He believed that it was something called acquired characteristics. The children received the same characteristics as the parent. There's some major flaws with that, because you can't receive all of the same characteristics as your parent. So let me dissect the concept of acquired characteristics for you. So imagine the most classic example that refutes this is something like a concept of like a blacksmith. A blacksmith, their job is to swing a hammer and constantly hit metal to shape heated metal into a number of things: horseshoes, weapons, armor, etc. So their arms get quite strong. Yet when they have a baby, that arm doesn't the baby doesn't come out with an arm that's like super butch. The baby is born with a regular arm. So what's happening there? Why doesn't the baby get the same arm as the parent? And again, your genes that you can pass on are just the blueprint, just the potential. That's the potential structure that the parent passes on to the child. So the dad is passing on the muscles, the structure, the basic skeleton, all the things required. He can choose, through putting himself to the proper environments, he can choose to eventually get that characteristic of having a strong arm by being a blacksmith himself, but he doesn't acquire that from his dad. He only acquires the basic blueprint from his dad. So what does get inherited? That's sometimes a tough question to consider. Like what can a parent actually give to their child? And again, that's just the basic blueprint. Like, you can get to be around this tall. Your bone density is going to be around this dense. Your average intelligence will be around this level. And then the environment decides the rest. The environment, like, speaking about, like, do you have enough food? If you don't have enough food, your brain isn't going to fully develop. Your muscles might not fully develop. Your bone density might not achieve the density that your structure tells it could be. So the environment has this basic blueprint to work with, and then the environment will adjust it as needed. So it's commonly also called nature versus nurture. The nature is like, what is your genes? What is the DNA that you have? What do you naturally have? The nurture is your environment. How are those? How is your DNA nurtured? How is it treated? Another good question: what isn't inherited? That is anything that happens in a person's life. Those environmental influences, those cannot be passed on to a child. Only that basic structure can be passed on from generation to generation. So when an adult has an experience or develops some sort of knowledge, or like those things that happen after the baby is born, the way that the genes change after a baby is born, those cannot be passed on to the child. So, for example, skin color. Like, you can have a certain skin color, and if you go outside and you're in the sun enough, anybody's skin will darken at least a little bit. That's called tanning. That doesn't mean your baby is going to come out very tanned, but that same baby has the same tanning capacity as you. We know that the people that have red hair, they tend to tan very little. So a baby can be born with that same red hair, with that same predisposition towards tanning, where they don't tan very much. That is inherited. That can be passed on to the child. But the amount of tanning that the parent has done, that has no impact on the baby. So the basic structures can be passed on. How the environment affects those structures is not passed on. Let's finish by reintroducing that analogy I had at the beginning about the house. So you have your basic blueprint for the house, and that when like for your body, you can pass that on to your children. But the things that you've done with the house along the way, the things you've done with your body along the way, tattoos, scars, amputations if needed, genetic mutations from like cancer, from smoking, like those things aren't passed on to your children. In the same way with a house, you have the basic setup for your house, but you can change certain things about it. You can change based on the environment. You can change the decorum, the furniture. You can change the landscape, but you can't change the structure of the house. That, again, the structure is what's passed on. All the other things that change over the lifetime, those are not passed on. Those are not heritable in children. So anyway, inheritance. We're all done for today. Thanks. Until next time.